Good morning. Hey, if we haven't gotten a chance to meet yet, my name is Dan Kohler, and I like to talk a lot, but not too much, so it's going to be hopefully in an acceptable zone. I could say like things like that and not get too embarrassed, but when I was younger, I would get embarrassed all the time, and I still actually get embarrassed a lot today. And if you've hung out with me for a period of time, you're like, that's not true. But it is true. I just if I intentionally head into embarrassment, it's okay. But if I do something that I want to be good at and I get embarrassed, that's not okay. So it actually got me, it kept me out of a lot of stuff, especially one of the biggest things I remember in high school were the school dances. Okay, now I could slow dance, because slow dance is a combination, at least at that time, of two things. Number one, waddling. I can waddle, okay, no problems there. Number two, you waddle while hugging a girl that you like, okay? No problems there. So I could do the slow dance. What I couldn't do was the fast dancing. No rhythm. I got nothing. I don't have anything to offer there. And I would want to, but I thought I would look at the people out on the dance floor and I'd think if I did what they did, I would feel so embarrassed. My embarrassment reaction has been so strong most of my life that I will be embarrassed on your behalf. Right? I don't know if you've ever felt that. You see somebody doing something that you think, if I did that, I'd feel super embarrassed. And so it actually keeps us from all of that kind of stuff. And it is something I've had to realize. My sense of embarrassment, whether it would actually be felt or not, actually keeps me out of a lot of things. It keeps me very inhibited from some of the things that I might like to experience in life. I never shook it on the dance floor because I was too embarrassed, all right? You're welcome for that, but I got to miss out on that. And, that's just one of the things. There's so many other things in life that my posture of fear toward what other people might think about me has actually kept me from a lot. So much so that I kind of learned this posture over time of if I can't do it well right away, I'm just not going to do it. And so I might do something one time, and if it didn't go so well, I'd look around, did anybody see that? And then never do it again. Right? It's just not happening. And, that's for me, it had a lot to do with embarrassment. Maybe for you, it doesn't have as much to do with that embarrassment feel. But here's what I do believe. I believe that all of us have learned some kind of posture in our relationship with others that has become somewhat inhibiting. Maybe for you, you might label it as embarrassment. Maybe other people might label it as rejection. Maybe you feel it in some other kind of emotional sense. Maybe it's the opposite end of the spectrum, and you kind of have this posture of pride. You also might not have a lot of friends then. I don't know, what to tell you. If your pride is keeping you from hanging out with people, that's a big inhibition too. But here's what I do know. However you want to label it, our posture in how we relate to others so that we can be perceived in the way that we want to be perceived can really keep us from experiencing a lot of beautiful things in life. Now, here's the question I really want to wrestle with this morning, is if we can start paying attention to how we've learned to posture ourselves in relationship with one another so that we can be perceived the way we want to be perceived. What I really get curious about is when we think about Jesus, and maybe you're here this morning and you don't know a lot about Jesus, or maybe you feel like you actually know a lot about Jesus. Either way, it doesn't matter. Whatever concepts come to your mind when I just say the person of Jesus, what happens when we take our understanding of how we posture ourselves toward others and we relate that with the person of Jesus? What do you miss out on because of the posture you've learned growing up when it comes to Jesus? Now, we've been, this month, starting last week, we're talking about encountering Jesus. And I believe our posture has a significant role to play in how we experience Jesus. I want to take a look at a story about Jesus this morning from Mark chapter 5. If you have a Bible with you, you're welcome to follow along. We're going to have it on the screen as well. Maybe you want to download the Bible app in the App Store. You can follow along there. That's always a good time. I don't know why it's a good time. It just probably is. So Mark 5, and we're going to start at verse 21 of Mark 5. Now, before we do, just a little quick background on Mark. Mark was not like a direct follower of Jesus that we're aware of during a lot of the stories that we're going to read. He kind of came along down the line, and he started following along with Jesus' other really close followers, and he heard a lot of stories repeated. Now, if you read the biography that Jesus' follower John puts together, he ends his biography saying, there's so many stories about Jesus that if we were to write all of them down, there's just not enough books in the world to contain that many cool things. So what we learn from that is that each biography that we have, and we have 4 different biographies of Jesus in the Bible, and each one is a little bit different. Now, Mark's is believed to have been the very first one, and his is the shortest. It's like the action-packed gospel. If you were like a cartoon or a comic book fan, Mark might be the biography for you, okay? Because it's just one thing right after another. They're short, powerful stories, at least in the first half of the account. Now, we believe, a lot of scholars believe that Mark wrote his first. And my guess is, Mark traveled with a lot of Jesus' followers. He heard a lot of stories about Jesus, and he probably recorded the ones that seemed the most significant to him and the ones that he heard over and over and over again. And that's how we have it. So what we hear from Mark is all of the stories that have been passed down that are probably some of the most crucial stories of Jesus that we have. It's like the core. You could build a lot of other stuff off of it, but we have the core information right here. So as we start in verse 21, we read this just phenomenal story. It says this: when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Now, that's not really where the story ends. There's more story there, but this is where the story of this particular woman ends. It's like a story within a story, because when we start off in verse 21 through 24, we see this other story happening. We see this guy named Jairus, and he's considered to be a leader or a ruler in the synagogue, which means that he had a lot of social status. Being one of the leaders in the synagogue, he would have been looked up to and admired by all the rest of the people in that town. Their towns weren't really massive. Everybody knew everybody. Religion was an incredibly important thing, and so having somebody who was in charge of the temple, he would have been revered. So we start with this person. That's his character. Like, that's who we understand his character profile. And his name's Jairus. And when we see Jairus, he rushes to Jesus as soon as he gets in town, and he throws himself in a place of humility, in a place of reverence toward Jesus. So that communicates a couple of things. First, it communicates that Jairus has a certain understanding about Jesus. Okay, he believes something about Jesus and his ability. So news about Jesus had spread a lot throughout the land. It was so that whenever Jesus traveled somewhere, he just got mobbed, and like people followed him everywhere. He's the kind of person not only that you wanted to be around, but that incredible thing seemed to follow him wherever he went. So Jairus hears about this, and as soon as Jesus lands on his shores, he approaches Jesus. And a crowd starts to approach Jesus as well. And they make way as they see Jairus because they want to defer to him. They want to give him space. And when they see him fall at the feet of Jesus, they're like, "Oh my goodness, who's this guy? Like, we've heard some incredible things about him. but he's not the religious leader in the area. And they see Jairus giving deference. They see Jairus giving honor to Jesus. And that makes them take note. And then they hear what Jairus has to say. There's this whole crowd around Jesus, and Jairus says, listen, my little daughter, she's dying. And if you continue reading the story, you find out by the time Jesus gets there, she's dead. So either she was dead by the time Jairus got to Jesus, or maybe shortly after. At any rate, when Jairus gets there, she's so close to death. And so Jairus runs up to Jesus and he says, listen, my daughter, she's dying. But if you come and if you put your hands on her, she'll live. You can heal her. That's what the crowd takes in. Now, as Jesus agrees, he just gets up and he goes with Jairus to Jairus' house, and on the way, something interesting happens. This crowd that has been standing around, they see what just happened. They hear Jairus' confession, and then something really interesting happens. We'll pick up halfway through verse 24. We read, a large crowd followed and pressed around him. So all the way to Jairus' house, this large crowd is following along. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. So there's a woman in the crowd, and she's been bleeding for a very long time. Probably had to do with her reproductive organs. It's probably not something that's a wound that just won't heal. People could see that. This woman had been bleeding for 12 years. Now, how could I possibly know that it wasn't a wound that you could just see on the outside? Because if it had been, nobody would have let her around. You see, in their religious culture, to have any kind of bodily fluid exposed, it made you ceremonially unclean. So you weren't allowed to worship with people, and you weren't allowed to be around them, and you certainly weren't allowed to touch them. Because if you touch something and you're unclean, you make that thing unclean. And if you touch a person, they become unclean. So here's the picture. We have a crowd that's pressing around Jesus, and they're walking down the road together. There's a confession from Jairus that if you can heal my daughter, or if you just lay your hands on my daughter, you'll heal her. And then there's a woman that's been bleeding for 12 years, and she's in the crowd, but nobody knows her issues. Because if they did, she wouldn't be allowed to be there, and she makes her way up to Jesus. But as she does, we kind of get this little insight on her. There was a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, and she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Now we're talking about a long time ago. Medicine is now, was progressed so far, it wasn't what it used to be. They didn't have doctors the way that we have doctors, but they did have medical professionals. People who had given their lives and were in a profession of being able to treat people medically. So they could probably do a number of things that other people couldn't. They could probably help bind some wounds. They might be able to do some amputations. They might even have some herbal remedies that they would give. And there was a certain amount of success to it. But we see here for this woman, whatever her bleeding was, they couldn't do anything about it. And so she would go from doctor to doctor. And there's probably a really good chance that in their small community, maybe they had a doctor, but very likely this woman had to go out and seek out doctor from different city after city after city, and she spent so much of her time in travel and on doctor's expenses and on all of these things just to try to get some bit of her life back. She'd been bleeding for 12 years. She'd been pursuing this healing for 12 years, and nothing happened good. Not only that, but I really do, I think, I don't know, but I think this woman kept her issue a secret because she didn't want to be an outcast. Already this illness, this malady would have cost her being able to have a close and intimate relationship with a man. It would have caused her an inability to be able to reproduce, to be able to have kids, to become pregnant. She couldn't do that. She'd be making everybody unclean. She wasn't allowed to. She had to keep it a secret. And so she lived in shame and fear, and she had a posture of distance from people, a posture of hiddenness, a posture of don't tell people what's going on. Save face, don't spend too much time around them. A posture of hiding. If there was an incredible amount of blood from time to time, she would have to be careful about that as well. All of the implications that go along with that. This woman lived her life publicly, but in hiding, in shame, in fear. But then this guy lands on the shore. And she knows the religious leader, Jairus. She's been around him before. She's kept her distance a little bit, but she's probably heard some of his teachings. And now she sees this guy that everybody respects. He falls at the feet of Jesus. And she starts to get a little bit curious. Maybe she presses into the edge of the crowd a little bit more. And then she hears what Jairus says. My daughter's dying, but Jesus, if you touch her, she'll get better. And a plan starts to formulate in her mind. Wait a second. Death is worse than my issue. So if he can touch her and she'll get healed, what would happen if I touched him? And so we continue reading. She'd suffered so much, and she only grew worse over the 12 years. But in verse 27, we read, when she heard about Jesus, and my guess is she heard about his reputation, but most importantly, she heard from the synagogue leader, Jairus. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd, and she touched his cloak. She thought this, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. You see, that's the plan that starts to formulate. Listen, I've got to be covert. I can't let anybody see. I have worked it out this long. All I have to do is I just have to go touch this guy. If he has the power to heal a dead girl, then I bet I could touch him, and I think I could be healed. I think I could be made clean. I think I could get my life back. It's a risky decision for the woman. It's risky because she has so much on the line. I think if I'm right, and I don't know if I am, but if I'm right, and she's hid this for 12 years, this is the moment that could ruin everything. This is the risk that if it doesn't pan out, she's still left where she is, and now she just touched one of the most significant religious figures to ever come by. And what if he knows? What if somebody sees him? What if somebody sees something about her? Or what if she's found out? It's risk. She might not even be able to live in town. I mean, actually, she might even be in danger because people are going to start thinking like, wait a second, you're unclean. We didn't know you were unclean. You've been unclean for 12 years? Do you know how long we've interacted with you? What did you do to us? But she takes the risk. And she comes up behind Jesus and she thinks, if I could just touch his clothes, I'm not even going to get close enough. I don't want to touch him. I don't want him to know what happened. But if I could just touch the fringe, some translations will say the fringe of his cloak, then I'll be healed. Incredibly, in verse 29, we read this. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was free from her suffering. Now there's two words, just studying this was a little bit fascinating, but there's two words that are used for the same word in English. If you don't know, this was not written in English. This was written in Greek originally. And so there's a Greek word that's for bleeding, and then there's another one used that in English, at least in this translation, it's translated as bleeding again, but they're two different Greek words. Now, why does that matter? Because in a second, it's going to show us the severity of the issue. The first one is just the word for bleeding, just like we might understand. It's a good translation. But the second one is actually not a word for bleeding. When she says immediately, when Mark says immediately her bleeding stopped, the word bleeding isn't just bleeding. It might be more likened to what we understand as a hemorrhage. Actually, the literal translation is a fountain spring. That's how significant it was. That's what the Greek translates into. It's a fountain spring. So how do you know that your body is healed? Well, the fountain shut off. It was there, and now it's not. She knew it. She knew it in her body. She knew that she wasn't just bleeding. This was not just a casual issue. This was something that was incredibly difficult to hide. It was a fountain spring. It was a hemorrhage of blood. Did it come and go? We don't know, but it was bad. As soon as she touches Jesus, though, she felt in her body immediately. It stopped. And I love this. She was freed from her suffering. Not just physical suffering, but I mean, any of us, like you just say the word shame and you know what that feels like, right? That's suffering. When you're hiding something and you don't want anybody else to find out, that's suffering. When you're physically suffering, we get that too. But she was also financially suffering. She was in all of these areas suffering, and immediately in her body, she understood something. She was free from her suffering. That's an incredible feeling. Now, I think at this moment, the woman touches Jesus, and the crowd is still pressing along. Like, they don't even know she's there. They're pressing along, and if you've ever seen like a movie star, even just on a video online or on social media, like they get out of the car and they're like almost immediately mobbed, and they have people around them that are like trying to keep people out, and that's probably the role of the disciples, is they were part like training in being a rabbi and part bodyguards for Jesus. Like they were just trying to keep people out. And this mob is just, they're following. He's just trying to get to Jairus' house. He's trying to serve Jairus, and this mob is just following him along. They're clamoring, and they're pressing in, and they're trying to just get a little bit of Jesus somehow that they can. And I think this woman, somehow she gets in there, and maybe she's crawling. I would imagine that if there's a hemorrhage of that severity for 12 years, she might have even been weak. Who knows? She might have even crawled in to the crowd on her hands and knees and touched Jesus' cloak. Just the fringe. And I think there was a moment that was probably just so powerful and emotional for her that the moment she felt the change in her body, she probably just stopped. She probably just stayed right where she was, and Jesus just kept walking. The crowd just kept pushing. But she knew something happened, and she couldn't move. Everything else that she thought mattered probably just kind of melted away. She was probably flooded with emotion, tears filling her eyes. For 12 years, she suffered, and now she's free. With just one touch. Jesus didn't even touch her, she touched him. And everything was different. Everything changed, and I think she probably just stood there or sat there or wherever she was, she probably just sat there in disbelief, like that really just happened. But as the crowd is moving on, we hear what else happens after she's freed. In verse 30, we read, "At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him." Now, there's a whole lot of things that require, like everything requires energy in life, right? Have you ever had an expenditure of emotional energy? Yeah. Have you ever been around somebody that's an emotional leech? It requires energy. I tell you what, ministry, things like prayer and counseling and all of those things, they don't just require physical energy, they don't just require emotional energy or mental energy, they require a spiritual energy. It's bizarre, and I don't know how to describe it to you. If you've experienced it, you know. But if you haven't experienced it, there's like an emotional energy that goes out of you when you minister. Like after today, after I get to hang out with you guys for a little bit until you choose to leave me, I'm going to go in my office. I'm going to crash hard. Okay, I'm going to be spent. There's an expenditure that happens. When we're praying with people, whether it's this morning or throughout the week, when Janine and I are praying for people, it requires a spiritual energy. And when something significant happens, it's hard to describe, but you feel it. Now, we believe that Jesus was both fully God and fully man, but the way he operated in ministry was in his full humanity under the power of the Holy Spirit. So that means when Jesus ministered, he felt what you and I feel when we minister. He felt it. He felt something significant. He was used to it because Jesus had gone around and he had laid his hands on people. He was expecting to go to Jairus' house, lay his hands on this girl, and he was going to expect that same feeling of power go out. But he was planning on it. What's interesting to me is along the way, Jesus is walking and somebody touches him and he feels the power going out, but he wasn't planning on it. He actually wasn't even expecting it. Now, Jesus knew by the Spirit a lot of the things that he probably shouldn't have known or that we wouldn't know. He had spiritual insights, and the Spirit spoke to him in a way to reveal some things, but I don't think that happened in this moment because Jesus was touched and he didn't know it. Now, what I'm trying to get at with that is this woman was healed without Jesus' participation. Isn't that wild? This is the only example I know where Jesus healed somebody but didn't intend to. This is the only example I know where Jesus healed somebody and didn't know it right as it was happening until after that power goes out of him. We read, Jesus realized at once that power had gone out, and so he turns around in the crowd and he asks, "Who touched my clothes?" He's like, "I know I didn't feel it on my body. Something happened." He knew it. Something happened, and so he says, "Who touched my clothes?" Now, if you read the accounts of Jesus, if you read his biographies, you'll learn something about his followers, the closest ones that he chose. They're dense, all right? They're a little thick, okay? I don't mean thick, I mean like thick, okay? He says, "Who touched my clothes?" And their response is, you see people crowding against you and you ask, who touched me? I love it so much that Jesus doesn't even acknowledge their statement. He's like, I'm just going to let you sit in that for a second. And he just keeps looking around. They're like, you see people crowding against you, and yet you ask, who touched me? In verse 32, we read this, but Jesus just kept looking around to see who had done it. You see, he understood there was a difference between people who were clamoring for his attention, who wanted something out of him, and somebody who had a true touch of faith. He knew there was a difference. Even though he didn't feel it in his body, he felt it when the power had gone out. He knew somebody touched his clothes. He knew something had happened. There was a different qualitative touch going on. Everybody was pressing and everybody was trying to reach out and grab a little bit of Jesus, but she touched his cloak and he knew that one. There was a different access to him, a different experience of the presence of God in the person of Jesus because of her action toward him, and he recognized it. Now, I think the crowd was continuing to press Jesus along. I don't know, but I have to imagine the scene, otherwise I don't know how to access it. And I imagine this crowd is just continuing, like, we're going to Jairus' house, let's go to Jairus' house. And I think the woman gets healed, and I think she just stands there or sits there, and Jesus feels the power going out of him, and as he's walking away, he starts looking around, who did this? And then I think he sees the woman who's sitting out at the edge, and I think they make eye contact, and I think they feel it. I think he's willing to let his disciples just be idiots. And he looks around for this woman. He's like, I know somebody touched me. And then he sees her out, and she's probably having this moment of encounter with the Lord that it's just unbelievable. And I'm guessing that they just for a moment make eye contact. And they see each other. And I think there's a beautiful knowing that happens. I think it's so deep and so powerful, even though it's not recorded in the story. I have to imagine that it happens because in verse 33 we read, then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet. They were already a distance away from her. How far? I don't know, but it was enough that she had to come back to Jesus. She was at the fringe of his garment, and then she wasn't at the fringe of his garment, and now she has to come back. And she comes and she falls at his feet, and the crowd makes way because Jesus is stopping everything. He's like, no, somebody touched me. Back up a second. We got to figure this out. He sees the woman. She knows she's been found out, and she gets back to Jesus, and she falls at his feet. And we read, it's not just a falling at a feet. It's not just an honoring, it's with fear and trembling. She's afraid. She's like actually afraid because she's been seen. You know how vulnerable do you feel when you feel seen? Like truly seen. There was one time I started spiritual direction. Spiritual direction is just the process of talking with somebody who's going to be like a spiritual friend. You're both going to listen to the Lord and help you grow, right? So I see a spiritual director pretty regularly. He's a phenomenal guy, and I remember the first time I got just on Zoom with him. Like, we do these over Zoom, and he looked at me, and I'm like, I'm not sure there's a computer here. I think you're with me, and you're looking into my very soul. Like, you see in me. I'm like, I just can't hide. You feel seen, you feel vulnerable, you feel laid bare. And I think that was a moment that this woman had. And so she runs and she falls at the feet of Jesus, and she's terrified. And we don't have any prompting from Jesus. We just simply have, who touched me? She tells Jesus everything. Everything. In the presence of this crowd, she just starts going on about the last 12 years. Scholar Alan R. Cole helps us understand the gravity of this situation. He describes it like this. In front of all the crowd, she must confess. Not because Jesus is forcing her to. Jesus hasn't forced her to confess anything. She just willfully confesses it. She must confess. It's being seen that draws her in to the confession. First, her great need of healing, and then the glad fact of her salvation. I love this line. That was a costly confession. That's a costly confession. What I love is nobody coerced her into it. She touched Jesus. She could have just walked away. She had what she wanted. She runs back to Jesus, and in front of the entire town, everybody that's interacted with her for the last 12 years, she chooses to go and rehash all of her issues. See, what I think is this one experience of the presence of God and the person of Jesus has just radically transformed how she understands her posture toward people. Not only that, but it required a posture change from her in order to experience that. So much so that she sees that being with Jesus is more important than anything else, is more important than saving face, is more important than anything anybody could think about. Because catch this, nobody else really understands what's going on. And she's going over her story. Alan Cole says that this was a costly confession. Why? Because what happens when you tell people that you did something that is equivalent of illegal around them and that they're in it with you just by association for the last 12 years? There's so many ramifications to this. It was a costly confession. It doesn't matter how it ended up, because the truth is, if this woman really had a fountain spring of blood, she's hiding it some way. That means the blood is still around her. It's still around them. She's still unclean. She ran back to Jesus, but she's still unclean. Doesn't matter if she's healed. There's bodily fluids. She's unclean. They're unclean. And they start thinking, what are you doing? If that's the case, why are you even here? You shouldn't even be around us. In fact, we don't want you around us anymore. That could be a very likely scenario. I'll tell you what, when I start feeling that shame or that embarrassment, those are all the thoughts that start running through my mind. Well, what if somebody finds out? What if somebody saw the real me? They'd reject me. This woman, unprovoked, runs back to Jesus, falls at his feet, and just says everything. I've been unclean for 12 years. I'm unclean now. In fact, if you all touch me, you're unclean. And I touched his cloak. He's unclean. But when I touched him, the blood stopped. I'm healed. I don't know how to explain it. I'm healed. That's it. That's her confession. But it was costly. Costly because it was risky. People saw her for the first time. Not just as she was, but as she is, as she truly is, with everything that she was hiding. Now she feels like, I have nothing to hide. I have nothing to hide. You know who the freest person in that crowd is? That woman. It's touching Jesus. It's the encounter with Jesus that made her the freest woman in that entire town, because I promise you, every single person in that crowd had no right to touch Jesus. They weren't any better than her. They were all unclean in their own ways. But this woman is the only one with the freedom to come forward, fall at Jesus' feet, and say, this is what happened. That requires something. It required her a change in her posture, a change in her posture that she'd learned over the last 12 years of hiding, of being filled with shame, of keeping just a little bit of distance, of rejecting relationship with others before they rejected her. She had to change her posture, and here's why she got her encounter. That's what I believe. Encounter with Jesus requires a posture of humility. You want to experience divine? You want to experience the presence of God? It requires us to change our posture from a posture that we've learned over time to a posture of humility. One that has this sense of, I've got nothing to lose, I've got nothing to hide. You can know whatever you want about me because this encounter with Jesus is the only thing that matters to me right now. She thought, if he could lay his hands on Jairus' daughter, then he can heal me. And that was the only thing that mattered. That was the only element of faith that she had. It was the only understanding of Jesus that she had. She removed herself from society effectively to stay safe, to stay unseen. She probably at best heard stories about Jesus. The only thing we know for sure is she heard Jairus say, he can heal somebody that's dead. She didn't know Jesus' teachings. Maybe she had never even seen him heal before. But she heard enough to think, that's the answer. That's what I need. That's what I need to encounter right now. And it drove her to the fringe of Jesus. And as she does so, she confesses everything. And we read in verse 34 that Jesus finally responds. And he says, daughter, it's the term like for your own daughter. He doesn't just heal her, he gives her dignity and a place. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Your faith has healed you. Wait, I thought it was the touch from Jesus. Like, wasn't it like the magic cloak that he wore? No, it was the touch from Jesus. But Jesus didn't touch her. No, right, that's true. It was actually her that touched Jesus. She accessed God, the power of God, by her simple faith that I think if I just touch him, I'll be healed. And Jesus calls that out. He doesn't call out anybody else in the crowd. In fact, even when Jairus comes up and says, I think if you lay your hands on my daughter, she'll be healed. Jesus just gets up and go, but now he stops everything. He's not even concerned right now. Not that he doesn't care, but he's not concerned with the dying girl in Jairus' house. He's concerned with this woman and her display of faith and her vulnerability before everybody. Daughter, he says, it's your faith that healed you. Yeah, faith in Jesus. It's Jesus that did it. But it was her faith that accessed the power of God on her own behalf that healed her. And so he says, go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Wait, well, she was already healed. Jesus isn't talking about go and be healed. He didn't heal her here. She was already healed. She felt it in her body. He's saying all of the things that were associated with that, you get to be free from now. She felt it. She understood it, but now Jesus speaks it. And he speaks it in the presence of everybody. She's free. She's free from you. And she's free from her uncleanness. She's free from her disease. She's free. She can be again. She can be a person again. She can be loved. She can be known again. She can know love. She can know a family. She's free. All because she changed her posture from a posture of hiding to a posture of humility. See, that's what mattered. That was the thing. That was the thing. And I think deep down, all of us want that sort of experience with Jesus. And there's some really good news for us. There's some really good news for us because you don't have to wait around for Jesus to pick you. He picked a lot of people. He didn't pick her. She picked him. She picked him. He didn't even see it coming. I want her on my laser tag team. He didn't even see it coming. She snuck up and she touched the fringe of his cloak and she was healed. It was her action toward Jesus, her posture of humility, and then that confession that came forward that just changed everything, changed the course of everybody's day. It changed the course of this entire town. It was her posture of humility that changed it. I think we can all have this kind of encounter. I do believe we can have this kind of encounter. A couple weeks ago, we just celebrated Easter, which is the resurrection of Jesus, which means something very significant, that the Jesus we read about in Scripture isn't dead. That he's alive and active, and that means you can encounter him today. You can encounter Jesus today. If that's what you want, I want to give you a few things you need to understand about encountering Jesus based on this woman's story that you're going to want to hold on to. And the first one is that encounter requires hunger. This woman had spent everything for the last 12 years on doctors. She was hungry for healing. She didn't know she was desperate for Jesus. She was just desperate for a cure. Whether you call it hunger or desperation, I don't care. But here's what I do believe. I do believe that all of us are desperate for something. All of us have a learned posture over time. And we've used it as self-preservation. It served you for the season you need it. You can embrace it and you can release it. Whatever posture you took, you don't need anymore. You need a different posture. You need one of desperation. This woman, she would let nothing stop her. She knew one thing about Jesus, and it was that he might be able to fix her. And she realized that the hunger, the desperation that she had, finally had an answer. If you want an encounter with Jesus, I'm going to ask you to examine your own hunger. All of us are hungry for something. Will you choose to locate the answer, the fulfillment to your hunger, the fulfillment to your deepest desire, the fulfillment of your desperation to be the person of Jesus? Everybody was clamoring after Jesus. There's all sorts of people that clamor after Jesus. There's a difference between the hungry ones and just the ones that want his attention. She was desperate. What is your desperation level? Now, I think sometimes in life brings us to a point of hunger and desperation. We get to that point where we don't have a different choice. But there's good news for us that you can choose whether you wait for that moment or you choose to start changing your posture and start thinking about, start reflecting on what do I hunger for? What am I desperate for? Why do I chase after that thing? She chased after the doctors. Now, we don't have a problem with doctors healing. We love doctors' healings. It's not about doctors healing or Jesus healing. It's about the fact that she had a hunger, a deep, true hunger for healing. And then she hears Jairus and she thinks, that's it. That's what I've been looking for. For 12 years, that's what I've been looking for. What have you been looking for? Do you even know? Do you even know what you've been looking for? Now, I think so many times, a lot of us who are in here this morning have had a bad history with the church. And if I could just speak plainly, I'm there with you. 100% I'm there with you. I've experienced it. Janine and I have experienced it. I've shared the bits of that story over the last few years several times. We have a history with the church. It's not great. We've had people ask us, why are you still in the church? We're like, we don't. Jesus. It's Jesus. That's why we're in the church. Sometimes I think we come to church thinking that will meet our hunger. Well, this is good. This is worthwhile. This is valuable. I believe in the gathering of the saints. But I believe we do that so that we can encounter Jesus, not so that we can encounter the brokenness of one another. Sometimes we've been disappointed in church because we were looking for the hunger and fulfillment to be fulfilled by those in church, and that'll never happen. I will let you down. The people around you will let you down. Jesus won't. So be hungry for Jesus. There's another thing that encounter hinges on. Encounter requires faith. So I want to clear this up. Faith isn't how much you know. Faith isn't how much you believe. It's not how strongly you believe. You can't whip up a certain amount of faith. You're like, well, let's go and touch Jesus. That hurt. I got a thing in my side. I'm 40 this year, so that's allowed to happen now. We can't whip up a certain amount of faith. We can't whip up a certain amount of belief. Right? So what do we know about this woman? She might know nothing but a few hearsays of Jesus. Maybe she saw him once. We don't know. The only thing we know for sure is she hears one thing about Jesus. And that was enough for her. We don't know that she agreed with the teachings of Jesus. Even if she heard the teachings of Jesus, we don't know if she agreed with them. We don't know if she accepted him as Lord and Savior. We don't know any of that. We don't know anything about her morality or her ethics or the way she lived her life. She might have been a rotten, horrible person. One thing we do know is she had just enough faith to believe that Jesus could fix something for her. That was it. Now, I don't know about you, that's good news for me, because I do not understand a whole lot about Jesus. I don't know everything there is to know about theology. I might be one of the lowest educated pastors in the valley. You're welcome. If that bothers you, no hard feelings, okay? Like if you're like, I need to find somebody smarter, I get that. I need to find somebody smarter too. So like, it's good news for me because I don't have to be enough. I don't have to be good enough. I don't have to know enough. I don't have to understand enough. Like there's plenty of us who will never understand enough about Jesus to be good enough. In fact, like if you know nothing about Scripture, I just want to fill you in really quick. The entirety of Scripture is about humanity trying to be enough on themselves, and God just keeps coming back and saying, I got you. I got you. I'm enough for you. Just learn it. It's okay. You'll get it. If not now, you'll get it later. It's fine. I got you. That's the story of Scripture. It's us trying to be enough on our own. The good news is you don't have to be enough. I don't have to be enough. I don't have to know enough. I just have to believe enough that if I could just touch the fringe of Jesus, my life will be forever changed. And then Jesus sends her away. He's not like, great, I'm going to need you to start learning. Like, you got to, like, synagogue. Lady, I know you haven't been there. I know you haven't been giving regularly. Come on. He's like, no, go be free. Go be free. Go live in a way that you haven't lived before. Just go be free. Go in peace. That's Jesus' instructions. He might not have been a very good pastor. He knew that one encounter with her, that leveraging of faith that allowed her to access him was going to change everything. That's what faith does. Faith is her action of touching Jesus. It's the understanding that if I touch Jesus, I will be changed. And it was enough. You want to encounter Jesus. Good news, it does require faith. Really good news, you don't need much. That's why Jesus talks about it as a mustard seed, because you don't need very much. You don't even need the whole tree. You just need the seed. That's it. From that seed, it's going to gain you access to the power of Jesus. You're going to have this encounter, and it's going to flourish into something beautiful, and you're going to produce massive fruit. It's one of the most beautiful stories, I think, in all of Scripture, showing this actionable faith. It takes very little faith. She had very little faith. We don't know if she had any goodness, but she had faith. Now, the last thing I want you to know is encounter requires cost. Now, one of the things that I've learned over the last 5 years, just watching people and thinking about the encounter with God, thinking about encountering God's presence, maybe you've never experienced that, that's okay. I believe there's an encounter in it for you today. One of the things I've noticed, and I look at it because my posture has always been in such a way that I've actually been limited from experiencing God in some ways. But it's on me, it's not on God. Right? Because I've had a posture of distance, of not being seen. And so I've looked at that and I've thought, like, Lord, why are all these people around me having encounters? And sometimes I seem to miss out. And I just want to share one of my learnings. One of my learnings is that I noticed over the last several years that the people who had the encounters with Jesus and the ones who didn't had a different posture. Okay? One looked at the cost and they said, I don't know if I'm willing to do that. I don't know if I'm willing to look foolish. And the other said, I don't know what foolish feels like. What I've noticed is that people who have the most regular encounters with Jesus are the ones who emote easily. They're in touch with their emotions. They're able to cry publicly. I will cry sometimes at certain Disney movies in the privacy of my own home. Sometimes I get emotional when I'm talking. Outside of that, I'm not a crier. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm probably going to live shorter than you. But you guys, like those of you who are in touch with your emotions, gosh, I think you have less inhibition to encountering the presence of God than I do. Because that's what I've seen over the last few years. What I've seen over the last several years is the people with the least inhibitions or the least fear about what they'll look like encounter God the most. They live in that posture. I live in this posture of what will people think about me if I got really weird? And there's these other people, they're like, that's not even a thought in my mind. I'm just going to go to weird and then we'll figure it out from there. Those are the people that have the most encounters with Jesus. Because the cost to them is not a factor. For me, it's costly. An encounter requires cost. I mean, this woman, she didn't have to go back and confess everything to Jesus, but she knew the moment that she confessed that it was worth the cost to go forward and experience more. And out of everybody in the crowd, she's the one that got Jesus' attention because she was willing to pay the cost. And all of these things that we're talking about this morning, it requires cost. It is costly. Humility is noble. We love the idea of humility, but to have a posture of humility is costly. It costs us something. Faith is costly. We have to do something. Encounter is costly. What you have to wrestle out with, is it worth it? I don't think encounter is difficult to come by, but it does require cost. If you're willing to pay that cost, I think there's something beautiful in it for you. I think that if we could learn to have a posture like this woman has a posture before Jesus, if we could learn to count the cost and we could learn to pay the cost, if we could learn that our faith doesn't have to be much, it just has to be enough to believe just this next step, I think we're going to be some of the freest people. I think we're going to be some of the people, catch this, this is not my phrase, and I don't know who said it. I did some diligent work to try to figure out who said it first. A lot of people said it. In Christ, when you experience that, you have nothing to lose, nothing to hide, nothing to fear, and nothing to prove. That's free. That's free. And I think that one encounter with Jesus could change the whole trajectory of your life. I think it will continue, but it is costly. It's so costly that we have people praying for you, willing to pray for you after every service and throughout the week. There's so many chances to experience God in community. And oftentimes I think it's the unwillingness to pay the cost, even just to walk up to get prayer, because we start to think, well, what will people think when I walk up? Will they think I have something wrong? Well, just news for you, like we all got something wrong. But some of us will encounter Jesus in our need and some of us won't, and it all depends on our posture. Maybe that simple act of walking up this morning when our prayer teams come forward, maybe that simple act of walking up to them is the same as the woman saying, if I could just touch the fringe. It's an actionable faith that meets you in your place of need. And maybe this morning, your encounter will be the first one you've ever had in a real and powerful way. It's open to you. It's available to you. Not because we are so good, but because Jesus is alive and active and chooses to work through his people. Broken people just like you, just like me. Because he's that good. The invitation is just to come and check it out. If you don't believe anything about Jesus, all you need this morning is enough faith to walk forward to get prayer. That's it. They'll take over from there. I want to pray for you this morning. The worship team's going to come forward, and then you're going to have a chance to encounter God if you want it. No shame if you don't. That's fine too.